The sound of the king's voice thundered through the courtyard. "Arrest him. Right now." Dozens of eyes turned. The royal guard everyone respected, the man who never flinched, never spoke out of line, now stood in handcuffs. But even as his wrists were bound, he didn't lower his head. He looked straight at the king, unshaken. And when the king demanded, "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the guard replied with just one word, a word that would echo through the palace walls and change the monarchy forever. Sergeant Arthur Hale wasn't born into power. He was born into silence, the kind that comes from years of discipline and duty. Every morning, he polished his boots until his reflection stared back at him. Every salute, every step, every breath was measured. Perfect, precise, emotionless. But behind that stone face lived a man who had seen too much. He'd fought in deserts where sandstorms swallowed entire battalions. He'd carried friends through smoke and fire. When he returned home, all he wanted was peace. So he joined the royal guards, believing, perhaps foolishly, that service to the crown would give his pain meaning. What he didn't know was that his biggest battle would not be on a battlefield, but right outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. The morning began with celebration. The king was hosting a ceremony to honor excellence in royal service. Cameras flashed. Trumpets played. The courtyard gleamed with gold. Arthur stood in his post, still, expressionless, while the king shook hands with diplomats and delivered speeches about honor, loyalty, and pride. But then, as Arthur's eyes drifted toward the garden, he saw something that made his heart sink. An old man, the palace gardener, George Weller, was being escorted out by security. A man who had tended to those same royal gardens for 40 years. He wasn't being honored. He was being fired. His only crime? He'd used the royal water supply to help nearby children's gardens during a summer drought. The king had called it a breach of protocol. Arthur clenched his jaw. To the crowd, it was just another royal decision. But to Arthur, it was a betrayal. Because George wasn't just a gardener. He was the man who'd once saved Arthur's life. That evening, during the next day's royal inspection, the air felt colder. Arthur stood in line with the other guards as the king approached, his polished shoes echoing like gunshots across the stone. The king stopped in front of Arthur. "Sergeant Hale," he said, "you seem distracted." "Permission to speak, Your Majesty," Arthur replied. The officers stiffened. No guard ever asked to speak. The king smirked. "Granted." Arthur's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "With respect, sir," he began, "loyalty isn't about standing silent when something wrong happens." The king's brow tightened. "Be careful, soldier," Arthur continued, his tone unwavering. "You gave a medal to a man last week for rescuing a lost royal dog. But you fired a man who's been rescuing people's lives for decades. That's not honor, sir. That's hypocrisy." The crowd of officials gasped. Cameras turned. The courtyard froze. The king's face turned crimson. "Arrest this man," he roared. 2 officers rushed forward. Arthur didn't resist. As they locked his wrists in iron, he stood tall, eyes forward, unbroken. The king stepped closer. "You disgrace your uniform," he hissed. "You think you can lecture a king about honor?" Arthur looked him dead in the eyes. And that's when he said it, that one word. "Remember." Just that. Nothing more. The king blinked. "Remember what?" Arthur's voice softened, but every syllable carried power. "Remember the man who once carried your father through the fire in the old palace, George Weller. The same man you cast out today." The king froze. His color drained. Because he did remember. Years ago, when the palace caught fire, a single gardener had risked his life to pull the royal family to safety. That man was George. The king turned pale. The world seemed to stop. The cameras that had once captured royal pride now captured royal shame. Arthur continued, his voice shaking but firm. "I don't serve power. I serve people. The crown means nothing if the heart beneath it forgets compassion." The officers holding him hesitated. Even they seemed unsure now. Unsure if they were arresting a soldier or a hero. The king stepped back. The weight of the truth pressed heavy on his chest. He looked down at the cuffs, his own symbol of punishment, and whispered, "Release him." No one moved. "Release him," the king shouted again. The cuffs fell. Arthur rubbed his wrists, leaving faint marks where the metal had bitten his skin. Then, in a moment that silenced the world, the king did something no one expected. He reached out his hand, not as a ruler, but as a man. "You reminded me of something I lost," he said quietly. "Thank you." Arthur nodded, then turned to the watching crowd. "No thanks needed, sir. Just remember." That night, the palace released a statement. The king personally reinstated George as royal gardener. and established a new Royal Service Medal for acts of humanity. But what the cameras didn't show was what happened right after. As Arthur left the courtyard, George was waiting beyond the gates. The old man smiled through tears. "You always were too brave for your own good, lad." Arthur smiled back. Someone had to remind him. The two men stood together beneath the palace lights, the soldier and the gardener, both servants of a crown and of conscience. And in that quiet moment, Arthur finally realized, sometimes the loudest battles are fought in silence. Sometimes courage isn't about fighting wars. It's about standing up for what's right, even when your knees shake. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, and comment your country below. Because the world doesn't need more kings. It needs more hearts that remember